Hello everyone and welcome to the Rift. Today, we're going to be making everyone's favorite content. That's right, it's a tier list. Specifically, today, we're going to be ranking decks in the current meta. There aren't too many decks in the game currently, at least not until the first set releases, but I think it's still important enough to talk about where the game is so far and how the meta has been developing with the cards that we have. First, let me explain the tiers. S tier means that something is too good to the point where it probably needs a nerf. Things in this tier generally negatively impact the balance of the game or the overall experience of playing. A tier. Things in this tier are great, often meta staples, or very impactful in niche scenarios. B tier. Things in this tier are playable. They're good enough to see a moderate amount of play. C tier. These things are niche. Certainly playable in a few scenarios, but don't have many other uses. D tier. Things in this tier are bad. Simply put, if you're enjoying this content, make sure that you like the video, and if you're feeling spicy, make sure that you smash that subscribe button just as hard as you'd smash your favorite League of Legends character. We're starting off in C tier today because there is no D tier, at least I don't think so. I don't really think there's an unplayable build of a deck that's been discovered. I mean, you can try your best and just make one and just throw random cards into a deck, sure, but that's not really a real build that people are playing. So I wouldn't really count that. I think all of the real builds that people have discovered and are playing in the game so far are in C tier and above. I think in C tier, we've got Mono Green Yasuo and Ramp Volibear. I think these decks are pretty niche. I think they overall have a negative matchup spread in the format currently, which means that they have losing matchups to most decks in the format. They certainly have more losing matchups than they have even matchups or winning matchups. I don't think they're unplayable because they still can win games, and they do have decent matchups from time to time, but I think mostly overall in the format, it's losing. Mono Green Yasuo is kind of just a worse version of the other two Yasuo builds. I think the consistency it gains from having only green runes isn't really worth it when you're sacrificing cards like Kayn and Rebuke, which are decent cards. Kayn especially I think is pretty good, and I think losing out on getting to play him is pretty big, so I think it makes this deck a little too linear and not have quite as high of a power ceiling as the other builds. So while it is more consistent, yeah, I don't think that's a worthwhile trade-off. And it's kind of the same situation with Ramp Volibear. I think that deck is very linear. It has a very straightforward game plan. You kind of know what it's going to do every game. It's going to try and stack a bunch of big bodies on one battlefield and just hold that for the whole game. That's kind of all it really does. It can capture some stuff in the early and mid game, but how it's going to try and win the game most of the time is by stacking a bunch of guys and making a big castle that the opponent just can't break through. I think the deck only being able to play that one way kind of loses out on a lot of the excellent aggressive pressure that the other builds of the deck can output. And generally, I just think that in the current format that we're in, trying to hold battlefields just isn't really a great win condition. It especially isn't great against Victor, who has cards like Stratagem that just beat you outright. Yasuo and other Volibear decks also have ways of beating you. Jinx is really the only deck that can struggle, but once it gets Rocket online, it can do rocket looping and put out enough damage to probably clear some stuff. Jinx is also pretty good at attacking in for a bunch of damage early and mid game, so some games you just won't have enough time to start building your castle because they'll just keep knocking it down as soon as you're setting it up. so you don't really have time against that deck afforded to you like you would against other slower, less aggressive decks. So I really don't think this deck has a great matchup spread into the format either. The other decks just have the tools necessary to beat what it's trying to do. It can still win games, yeah, if the opponent doesn't draw the correct stuff, but I think more often than not they will. I think this deck might have a winning matchup into a few things, but overall I think it's pretty even or losing into most decks. On to B tier next. I think this is where both of the good builds of Yasuo land, and also where I'd put the worst version of Jinx. I think the aggro build is a bit better than this combo-y build that tries to pop off with purple Jinx more. Let's first talk about Yasuo, because I think Yasuo overall is probably the weakest of the legends in the game we have currently. The deck is just very inconsistent. It can brick a lot. It relies on spells heavily. It's interactive spells to be able to stop what the opponent is doing. So drawing the wrong spells in the wrong matchup is really bad, and also drawing too many spells just in general is also really bad. The deck doesn't have too many units, so there's a problem too. If it doesn't draw enough units, sometimes it just can't play, and if its units get killed, sometimes you also just can't really play. That said though, if its units do stick around and it does get to play its game plan out, the deck is quite strong. I think being able to stick your Yasuo champion on the board and attack with it every turn is a huge amount of offensive pressure that the opponent kind of is just pigeonholed into giving you units for free. So when this deck gets going, I think it's very strong, but when it doesn't get going, which happens quite a lot actually, I think the deck just completely folds and falls apart. You have a lot of good tools in the deck theoretically. Counter spells are very strong in the format. Pump spells are also very strong. Gust and Rebuke are pretty good too, but they're a bit more matchup dependent. So theoretically, the deck should be really good, but in practice, it just isn't, because sometimes you just don't draw the right cards. This deck suffers a lot from not having enough cards in the card pool right now, and especially not having sideboards to be able to better tailor your deck into the matchup in games 2 and 3. In a best of 3 match, which I'm really hoping this game gets. I'm really hoping we have sideboards when competitive best of 3 play comes out. Otherwise, I think decks like this are just unfeasible to play competitively. At least they're quite inconsistent, and that's not something you want for competitive play. This deck has matchups it's very good into, and it has matchups it's very bad into, which is also not something you want in competitive play. A sideboard would help even out its matchup spread a lot and could bump it up into A tier, but who knows. I think between the mid-range build on the left and the more spell-heavy control build on the right, I think the mid-range build is just slightly better because it lays a bit more units. When I played it, it felt a little bit better into its bad matchups while not sacrificing much power into its good matchups. So overall, I think it's slightly better than the control build, but they're pretty comparable. For purple Jinx, the more combo-y build of Jinx, it's not that much more combo-y. The decks aren't that much different. I just think having the red Jinx in your chosen champion zone is a lot better than having purple Jinx. It gives you more consistent early game pushing power. It also gives you a consistent discard outlet so you can start drawing cards faster with Jinx's legend effect. And I think the purple Jinx build is just a little too slow compared to that build. Purple Jinx takes time to get going and it takes setup. It doesn't really do much by itself. You need other cards that can facilitate its full potential. So it's a little less consistent and a little less strong in the early game, which is where Jinx really wants to be strong. I think red Jinx is just a little bit more powerful and a little bit more consistent on its own, which is what you want in the deck, because a lot of the time it will just be on its own because you're top decking. You don't really know what cards you're going to draw. So you could draw cards that synergize well with purple Jinx, or you could just not. So I think overall the purple Jinx build is just a little bit slower and less consistent than the red Jinx build, so I put it down in playable. You can make an argument that it's a bit better than Yasuo because you're still playing Jinx at the end of the day, and Jinx is pretty good, I think. But I think the decks in B tier are pretty close in power level to the decks in A tier. There's not that much of a difference between the tiers, but it is still noticeable when you play a lot of games. I'd say the decks in B tier have a mostly even matchup spread across the board. There are some decks that they're winning into, some decks that they go even into, and some decks that they lose to. I think overall it's about even. Some could be slightly losing, some could be slightly winning. I don't really have the amount of games necessary to test that, but it would be my guess that they're about even. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have A tier. These are the decks that I think are currently the best in the format that we have so far. Victor, I think, is the best deck in the game. Not by much, mind you, but it still is a worthwhile distinction to make. I really do think that the other decks in A tier have at least an even matchup into him. From what I've tested and from what I've seen at least, Jinx, Aggro Jinx, and Aggro Volley do have a decent enough time against him that I'd consider the matchup about even. Again, I really don't have the volume of games necessary to confirm that right now. They could end up being slightly losing against Victor or slightly winning against Victor. I don't really know, but as far as I've seen, the matchups are about even. Jinx can give Victor a bit of trouble in the early game. Sometimes she just has too much aggressive pressure for Victor to really bounce back from. And it's the same with Volibear. I think if Volibear draws a good hand and Victor draws an average hand or even a bad hand, then Volibear probably just wins. But on the flip side, if these decks don't draw the right cards against Victor, they probably just lose because Victor's pretty consistent. I think Rocket and Challenge being able to hit Victor's base is probably a big reason as to why the matchup doesn't feel that bad. They aren't allowed to just freely sit guys in their base and build up stuff against these decks, and trying to trade 1-for-1 against Jinx doesn't feel great because Jinx just gets to draw extra cards and will out card advantage you eventually. Victor doesn't have that fast of a start earlier on in games. He doesn't have any accelerate, and he kind of needs to set up a few guys and a few tokens first before starting to attack. So aggressive decks like these, especially if they're going first, can give Victor a bit of trouble in the early game. Sometimes there's just not much you can really do to try and take battlefields from these decks, at least in the early game. You need to draw your removal spells, you need to draw your siphon power, and even then you're probably just trading 1-for-1 still, which, like I said, isn't that great against Jinx. And if they're able to hold on the battlefield that generates them a token, then your suite of removal spells become even worse against them. That being said, Victor is still Victor. I think it's the best deck in the format. It's consistent, it's very strong, it has great removal spells, it has great units, and I truly think that this deck doesn't have a single bad matchup in the game right now. I think it's either even or winning against everything on this list. It may have a slightly bad matchup against one of the other decks in A tier. I don't really know because I haven't tested enough games to really figure that out, but I would say they're even. I think Jinx has mostly winning and even matchups across the board, except I think it can struggle a little bit against Volibear. Sometimes they just put too many big guys on the board and you don't have enough killing power to get rid of them all. And they have cards that trade positively, like Snapvine and Deadbloom and Stormbringer and Challenge. So you getting to draw extra cards probably doesn't mean that you're going to be ahead in card advantage. You're probably just going to maintain an even card advantage state, which is not good against Volibear because card for card, Volibear's card quality is a lot higher than yours. You have a lot of small cheap units and they have a lot of big units. So I think Jinx can struggle a little bit sometimes into Volibear, but other than that, it has either either even or winning matchups, so I think it deserves a spot in A tier. Volibear as well has mostly winning and even matchups. I think it can struggle a bit into Yasuo, but that's really the only thing it struggles against. You have a difficult time sometimes dealing with the Yasuo champion. If you don't draw challenged, you just can't beat it, and if Yasuo gets to stick around on the board throughout the mid to late game, it becomes a problem for you. Because no matter how big of guys you try to play, Yasuo can probably just punch over them with pump spells. But if you can kill their Yasuo, you probably just win. That's a lot easier said than done though. Challenge is really your only consistent way of doing that, and they have counter spells to stop your challenge. But other than the Yasuo matchup, I think it's pretty much even and winning into most other decks in the game. It could have an even matchup into Victor. It could also be slightly losing or slightly winning. It feels like when Volibear draws well, it should probably win against Victor, and when Volibear doesn't draw as well, it should probably just lose. It's got the same early game pressure as Jinx. Not as much early game pressure, but enough to really give Victor some trouble sometimes. And especially with the battlefield that gives you a token when you hold, you can have counterplay against Cole, which is very good in this deck. So I think when you get the right amount of early game offensive pressure, plus drawing into your cards that trade positively, I think you should just win in the matchup. But if you don't draw that well, then it's not going to go well for you because you're playing against Victor. I would still definitely put this deck in A tier. Feels very strong. When it draws well, there's not really a deck in the game that can beat it, but when it doesn't draw the curve that it wants to, it can struggle a little bit in certain matchups. I think it's decently consistent. You do play a lot of redundant cards, a lot of early game pressure, a lot of mid game, and some late game stuff, so you shouldn't have too much trouble drawing into a good curve, but obviously it's a card game, so that doesn't always pan out. I don't really want to put Victor in S tier. I think he's an A tier deck. I don't think he's too much stronger than the other decks in this tier to the point where he just deserves a tier of his own, and I certainly wouldn't call him tier 0. I think all three decks in this tier are viable options. Victor might be slightly better, but I don't think it's enough to warrant putting him in his own tier. Although I will make a distinction that he is the best deck and does have the best overall matchup spread in the game currently. So balance-wise, the game overall I think is pretty well balanced so far. If the game's first set comes out and most decks are in A and B tier, I think that's a pretty good spot. Playing the game so far and making this tier list and similar videos makes me hopeful that the game is going to be pretty well balanced and pretty fun to play when it comes out. I haven't really seen any reasons to suspect otherwise, so alright, that's it for today. Shorter video this time, but I'm gonna leave you with that for today. And as always, thank you for watching my content, sticking with the channel this far. I really appreciate it. Alright, take care.